Hey, welcome to another segment of I Was Just Thinking. My name is Rudy Maxa. I'm a former Washington Post investigative reporter for about 20 years, but somehow fell into travel journalism by mistake. Believe me, it wasn't planned. And as you may know, my series on PBS, 98 shows on PBS. And when COVID started, I do this weekend radio show and I have these interviews that are 6 minutes, 7 minutes long, which is sort of frustrating sometimes when you have a great guest. And recently I had a great guest, and I'm fortunate enough to have her as my guest today. And I'll introduce you to her in just a moment. But first, let me tell you this. I know you're watching this live at, depending what time zone you're in, noon in California, 3 p.m. on the East Coast. This is not a live episode, so you will not be able to ask questions. Candacy, my guest, had some time conflicts, but we were just lucky to get her for this for 45 or 50 minutes at this time. So this has been recorded on Thursday, February 18th. So if you're watching on YouTube, that'll tell you something. And I was just fascinated when I interviewed this author on the weekend radio show, and I really wanted to talk to her at great length. Her name is Candacy Taylor, and she wrote a book that is not a new book, but it's relatively new, but it didn't just come out this week, called Overground Railroad. And it is a sort of the spine of the book is spine of the book. That's the wrong word. The platform for the book is a look at a travel guide called the Greene book that existed for about 25 years. And it was a guide for Black families or individuals who wanted to travel in America. Because between 1936 and 1967 is when that book was published. Because traveling, I guess, talk about driving as Black, traveling as Black was not an easy thing. And in some cases, it's still not easy now. If you're not Black or a minority, you may not really think much about that. I mean, those of us with white skin sort of get in the car and just travel. It wasn't so easy, and it may still not be so easy for some people. At any rate, I know you've seen pictures of from early civil rights days of separate water fountains for Blacks and for coloreds, as they were called, and whites, and Greyhound terminals in the South. And I'm sure you've read about famous musicians, Black musicians, who, when touring with other band members who might be white, had to stay in separate hotels. But it goes a lot deeper than that. It goes really deep. And my guest is in your lower right-hand corner. Her name is Candacy Taylor. She is the author, obviously, of this book. And we are going to talk a little about what it was like back then, how she did her research. She worked 3 years and finding places that were in the Greene book and sort of telling the history of Black travel in those days. Now, I don't want this to sound like some kind of Michelin or AAA guidebook, although it did give restaurants and hotels and that sort of thing. But it really is, in some cases, a survival guide. It saved lives. In fact, I have a quote here I wanted to read you. First of all, Candacy, welcome to the show. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Nice to have you here. I want to quote this gentleman. I looked him up online and I wasn't sure which Dino Thompson I was looking for in Google. Who is Dino Thompson? You quote him, in your book?
He is a man who I interviewed. I got a grant from the Library of Congress to interview Green Book business owners because about 3% of these businesses that were listed in the guide are actually still operating. And Dino Thompson grew up in the town where one of the Green Book sites was really popular, and he went there as a child or as a teenager. And so he had this kind of first front row seat to really what was happening in the town of, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. It was called Charlie's Place.
Well, I wanted to read his description of the Greene book, that guide that came out for so many years. He said, it didn't tell you if the place had a good steak or great seafood or had a soft bed. It told you where you would be safe. It told you where you'd be welcome and not made to go around the kitchen and order something to go. The rest of the guidebooks out there are just fluff. To my mind, it's still the most necessary travel guide that's ever been printed. And I learned so much from this book, and it was a fascinating read. For example, I didn't know what sunset towns were.
Sundown towns.
Like sundown towns.
Yeah. They were all white towns. They were all white on purpose. And they were pervasive really through the Midwest, the North, and the West, the Western United States. And when you think about it, most people assume because Jim Crow it's just notorious for its segregation signs, and it was so clear that the Jim Crow South was just kind of demonized for how they treated race, but it was really the rest of the country that was just as bad, if in some ways more insidious, because there were so many of these towns where literally there would be a sign at the county line saying "N-word, don't let the sun set on you here," or there was a bell that would ring at 6 p.m. alerting the local laborers, domestics, and black men who were working in the town. That was their cue that they had to leave. So it was a very hostile country. If you happen to be on the road, for instance, I wrote a book on Route 66, and that's how I found the Greene book. Was I was commissioned to do this travel guide on Route 66, and realized that 99% of all the books, the big major travel books on Route 66, were written by white men. And the one question I kept coming across when I learned about sundown towns, because half of the counties on Route 66 which travels from Chicago to Los Angeles.
Santa Monica, yeah.
Yeah, they were all 44 of the 89 counties were sundown towns. Yeah.
I mean, I'm an old guy, and that's extraordinary for me. I'm just surprised. I've never heard that phrase.
And there's a book, actually, the way I learned about them was it was James Lowen's research. He wrote a book called Sundown Towns, which is kind of the definitive history. And he's a white man who was able to get back into these sundown towns and really have those deeper conversations. So I highly recommend your listeners read.
I don't know how deep those conversations were. Basically, if you were as black, you had to be out of town by sundown. I mean, that's a pretty straightforward, ugly thing. Yeah. One thing that I found from the book was that this is not necessarily ancient history. That in 1994, fast food, the chain Denny's, paid $54 million following a lawsuit that brought to light the fact that black customers had to wait longer and sometimes were charged higher prices than whites. That's in 1994. Mm-hmm. Even I can remember 1994. Yeah. And this was not a one-off occurrence, was it?
No, and I mean, we still have, iterations of this happening that continue to happen throughout our history. It really is baked in the DNA of this country. I think pretending that we've somehow gotten over this, obviously when Barack Obama was elected, a lot of people hoped, maybe we could close that chapter now. And with, recent politics, and it's in our face pretty much every week where there's another incident that happens, variations of whether it's, I think, there's a pool, the Westin before COVID happened, where, a black woman was harassed and couldn't get into the pool. There were so many, Starbucks,
right?
birding while black. I mean, there's just, barbecuing while black. I mean, yeah.
And back in the day, some women black women weren't allowed to check into a hotel alone, even if they came with their husband. Sometimes they had to use
that was true for women of any color, though. White women too. You were just suspected if you were alone. You were probably a prostitute.
Of course.
Yeah.
It actually happened in England. I once was reading a history of one of those classic hotels in London. It was the same thing. And the first hotel to allow women in did great. I mean, it really, and all the other hotels went, wait, hang on here. Now, even gas stations would sometimes refuse to sell gas to blacks. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, and it was, or if they would sell the gasoline, then they wouldn't let you use the facilities. The one constant kind of bright light in that sad truth was Esso gas stations, which is ExxonMobil today. Actually, it's the same company.
Yeah, give us a little history. How did Esso, now ExxonMobil, how did Esso cut the water before some others on that. As I recall from your book, there was a CEO or chairman of the board or something who had some very strong feelings about racism.
Yeah, well, Rockefeller was the CEO of Standard Oil, which was Esso at the time. And his wife, I believe it was his wife that was his conscience, Laura Spelman. She grew up with parents she grew up with a house on the Underground Railroad. And her parents were fierce abolitionists. This was a white woman, clearly. But they, I believe, instilled this sense of justice in her in terms of race. Spelman College is named after their family. That's how important they were. And Spelman College is historically, it's a HBCU. So I believe it was her, Rockefeller being married to Laura Spelman, I think had to have an influence. But at every level of Standard Oil, there were Black people. There were Black chemists at Esso. There were Black men franchising their own gas stations, not just working, in the station. They had an incredible number of, just in every stage of the business, except for, but some held management positions. And it was really unprecedented. And it was it would even be unprecedented today in a lot of companies. So they really were on the right side of history. And I think they should be celebrated. Actually, ExxonMobil is the sponsor for my exhibition based on this book. And that's traveling the U.S. for 3 years. So they were the perfect fit.
Now, tell me about this exhibition. This is some of your photographs you took, and we're going to look at a couple in just a moment. What is the exhibition that Exxon's underwriting? Yeah,
the exhibition is, I'm the curator and content specialist it's with the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service. So it's the traveling arm of the Smithsonian. And it's about a 3,500 square foot exhibit. And it will travel the U.S. for up through 2024 now. It had to get delayed because of the COVID openings. But there's 11 or 13 venues. Things are being shifted around. But it's an incredible opportunity to show not just my photographs of the sites that are still here today, but it also retraces this history of Black segregation, but also Black liberation, Black empowerment, what we were able to do despite all the obstacles. A lot of these communities where Green Book sites were located were in traditional Black communities. And like Harlem or Bronzeville or the South Central Los Angeles. And at the time, these were vibrant communities with, Black-owned businesses. They were self-sustaining. They had great music and great food. And if you could just get yourself there, then there were barbershops and all these drugstores and all these places that the Green Book listed. Because as you said, it was not just a Michelin guide or a AAA guide. The Green Book had every kind of business you could imagine, from funeral homes to sanitariums to doctors to liquor stores, obviously hotels and food. But it was just a testament to how many places Black people were shut out of in this country when you look at the listings in the Green Book. And so the exhibition really shows, artifacts from these sites that we've lost, but also really vibrant and beautiful photographs of Black people, Black Americans living their best lives despite the circumstances.
How can we find more information on that and where it might appear, where the exhibition might be at any given time is what I mean?
Yeah, the exhibition, I believe it's still up, but it's not open because the museum is closed. But it launched at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. And
would your website eventually have some information when things start corking again?
If you Google Negro Motorist Green Book, Smithsonian, you'll see they have a website up. And the next venue will be at the Mosaic Templars Museum in Little Rock, Arkansas. But with COVID, it's just very, so I definitely recommend just looking at the email. Oh my gosh.
It's New York.
About that. Should I?
No. Real life, it's fine, Candacy.
Yeah.
You write that by 1938, there were nearly, let me look at my notes, there were nearly 30,000 retail stores owned by blacks in the United States, 300 hotels, 3,000 black funeral directors, 34,000 hairdressers, and 15,000 black tailors. And as I said in introducing, you spent 3 years traveling around the United States. You visited 5,000 Green Book sites. And you, as you say, only a few, 5% maybe, are still in operation. Let's, Joe, our engineer, our producer, Joe, could you put up a couple pictures of some of the, now these are pictures from Candacy's book that I took a picture of, so I could put it here on the screen. Let's run a couple of the black and white ones there, Joe, if you can. Candacy, I don't fault you if you can't remember exactly what this is, but I know the first one is a nightclub. In fact, it's a very cool design. Yep, there it is. Oh, I mean, it's so, yeah. I don't know why it's flickering, but it's so interesting, the design in its simplicity, a clean design.
Thank you. Yeah, that's Elks nightclub in Phoenix, Arizona. And yeah, the fact that these places are still with us, you know, it's really, and even I started this research in 2013. So I've been working on this project for like 7-8 years, I guess.
Oh, you're still, there we go.
Yeah, and it's, you know, there's something really sublime about just the simplicity of that.
Is it still
that was
open?
A good day of shooting.
This is still open?
No, it wasn't open when I was there. And I was there probably in 2016, I think, when I took that.
Okay. It's just an interesting piece of architecture. And it's, again, in its simplicity. So yeah. What else you got there, Joe?
Oh, that's the Makin. The Makin Hotel, which is in Columbus, Ohio. My parents and my sister actually went there when they were young. And it's just a standard, it's the back of the Makin, and it's all boarded up, and it's still boarded up. You know, I am working with companies, organizations like the National Trust and the National Park Service to see about preserving these buildings and getting them on the National Register, and really kind of highlighting how important it is to protect and update these resources. I mean, I think that they're this tangible evidence of what happened. And when you look at the state of these communities today, it tells us a lot about the policies in our country that have kind of really taken away the stature and the power and the self-sufficiency that Black communities had during that time.
Well, sometimes, and I know they're on purpose, sometimes urban renewal would plow right through the middle of, I mean, not just Black neighborhoods, also sometimes Asian neighborhoods and so on. Thus, destroying is too strong a word, but really breaking it up. And you sort of look back and go, everything was going fine. Why did we have to put a freeway right? Why did we have to break up that neighborhood?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, because they weren't going to go into the higher end white neighborhoods, and that's what they did. They targeted the lower income or the redlined neighborhoods. And there were places during my field research, I took probably 7 trips. And I mean, I would drive, you know, I would scout up to 30 sites a day. And there would be times when there would be a place where there would normally have been 10 or 20 even Green Book sites on a street, and it was completely replaced with a freeway.
You also write that there are many YMCAs, of course, I suppose everybody knows that stands for Young Men's Christian Association, that would not accept Blacks. I mean, that doesn't reflect that.
Well, there were some that did, though, and that's why, and they were in the Green Book, thankfully. There were some that were called Phyllis Wheatley's. There were YWCAs as well that were in the Green Book. But yeah, it was, again, you needed a guide. You needed some kind of tool to tell you where to go.
Well, you write that there's a doctor in 1935, a physician named Dr. B. Hurst, who had been turned away from being able to obtain a room at 5 Manhattan hotels. And he actually filed a lawsuit against those hotels and won $400 plus damages. Yeah. There were small victories, obviously. Do you have another black and white shot there, Joe, that we could put up? The third one? Do you remember where that is?
Oh, yeah, that's Los Angeles. And that is the Norba Hotel. And that's in an area of Los Angeles that is literally Skid Row. It is something out of, I don't know if people remember The Wire, but there was that whole season called Hamsterdam.
Yes, well, The Wire is the greatest television series ever, yes.
Yes, I agree too. Thank you. But yeah, Hamsterdam, that's what it's like. It's literally, it looks apocalyptic. And I lived in Los Angeles for years. When I started this project, I was in LA. And I would drive to this area regularly because there were Green Book sites there. But it's right off the, it's very, very close to, it's essentially in downtown Los Angeles. It's just a little east of the downtown center. Right. But it is criminal. It is really criminal how it's not just tent cities. It's like it's a community of just neglect from the forces that, that are really should be held accountable for how bad it is. And there's a lot of stuff on the news now, and LA has been trying to fix this homeless problem, but this started in the 70s, and soon after these Green Book sites, because the Green Book is in publication until 67, and once integration happened, we can talk more about that later, but it really did shift how these neighborhoods function, because now that Black people could leave and go to downtown to further the places that were all white, a lot of these places went under because they weren't getting the support that they normally got. But it's very, it's sad, because when I finished the scholarly research, I got a fellowship at Harvard under the direction of Henry Louis Gates. And when I left Harvard in 2016, I was going to head back to LA. But I ended up literally just living on the road for another 3 years.
Oh my goodness.
Really just going and because I knew I had to write the book. I knew the book had to be finished. And, but I hadn't finished all the field research. And once I really did see the state of these neighborhoods, because I could have written the book after leaving Harvard. I had enough information. I could have written it would have been a very different book. But having gone out and photographed these places and seeing the state of the neighborhoods, I thought that this has got to be a part of the story. We've got to contextualize this history to today and show what social forces and governmental forces really shaped these communities and what happened.
Joe, can you put up a copy of the cover of the book for folks who might want to see it? And Joe, I don't know, can you put Candace's name and book title in the, that thing over to the right, or is it that we usually have when we have guests? Okay, there's the cover of Candacy Taylor's book, The Green Book and the Roots of Black Travel in America. When you were traveling, Candacy, when you were going to these sites, these several hundred sites that you visited, did you find folks in the neighborhood who remembered what that was, or did they look at you with puzzlement when you looked at a hotel all boarded up like that and found it interesting and took a picture? Were they like, what are you doing?
Yeah, a lot of times I tried not to be noticeable when I was driving around. Sure. I travel by myself, which I prefer it that way. But yeah, I generally would go and scout, which would mean I would just drive and photograph a lot from the car. It's actually a really good angle to take photographs from your car window, because when you're standing, it's a really perfect angle. But as soon as I would get spotted, say in places like Skid Row in LA, I got chased and almost assaulted by a mentally ill person. So it's not the safest, job that I was doing, and I traveled with a stun gun and mace and, in my car. Yeah, it was very serious. So I usually it was after I did my scouting trips. That's why I'd have to go back. If I found places I was like, oh my gosh, that's still operating, or there's something interesting about that, then I would do the research, find the people who were running it and call them. And when I got the grant from the Library of Congress to actually interview some of these business owners, was when I could go back and we could, I could hear the stories and reminisce, about what it was like for them. But it was a process for sure.
Well, I think you can probably take down the cover, Joe. Let's talk about integration. It sounds like integration meant that black folks could go to white folks' places, but not a lot of white folks went to black folks' places. So that cost them a lot of business in lost business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, integration. There's a chapter of the book. It's called the double-edged sword of integration, because it was really something that a lot of Americans, black and white, wanted. But it was very complicated. And some white businesses wanted it just because money was green. They didn't care, that black people were coming. It would just increase their revenues. And
right.
People knew after the Brown versus Board of Education was in 1954, the country was kind of preparing itself for we're going to do this eventually. So the Greene book was great even in the early 60s because it was there's some of the earlier edition in the 62, 63 edition where it says, know your rights. And they go state by state, like what were the laws and how you were really able to be treated. Because some would say you can't do this or you can do that. And they're like, no, we have it here to show you what the laws are and how they just wildly change from state to state. So when it all came under the umbrella, when the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, there was a sense of relief because it's like, okay, we don't have to go through those layers anymore. The Greene book was still out until 67. So there was still clearly, they felt like there was a need to keep publishing it, even though this Civil Rights Act had been passed. But what happened was, like I said, a lot of these Greene book businesses that were just icons in the community, like the Dewdrop, which was a great, fabulous nightclub in New Orleans, had all kinds of the big acts, James Brown and all the big names would come, and white folks loved to go to the Dewdrop, and it was still illegal. Integration was still illegal. So white people would come and the cops would come and shut them down. And finally, even the head of the Dewdrop, he ended up suing the city in 64 because the cops would still harass him because it would be this integrated nightclub. But once black people could go to the French Quarter, because before that, black people weren't allowed to go to the French Quarter. So once they were allowed to go to the French Quarter, they stopped going to the Dewdrop. And it literally just, became, it just lost it was just really sad to watch its demise in the I think it was closed by 1970s. And then it's still around though, in terms of the building is still there. I'm actually talking with a man who's planning on purchasing the building, and we're thinking about rehabbing it. So there's still maybe life, possible with the Dewdrop. But there's places like the Hampton House in Miami that sat in ruins. But this was a place where King rehearsed his I Have a Dream speech. It's where, my gosh, Malcolm X proselytized Cassius Clay. He walked in as Cassius Clay and left as Muhammad Ali. There's a movie now I believe it's on Netflix, that may be up for an Oscar that, shows the Hampton House. And that's what that is. It was a Greene book site.
Right.
And it literally was sitting in shambles. It was in ruins. And even though there was all this incredible civil rights history tied to it, but one woman named Enid Pinckney, she was in her 70s when she remembered this place as a kid, and she thought, oh my God, I can't watch this. I can't let this happen. She spearheaded this preservation effort. It's like a $9-10 million renovation that this place went under, and it's beautiful today. So what we can do is, really amazing. But somebody said about the Hampton House, who regularly went there, in terms of integration, she was like, we got what we wanted in terms of integration, but then we lost what we had. And so that's a double-edged sword. It's like we lost the vibrancy of these communities, right, and the entrepreneurship and the self-sufficiency that came with, being a Black business owner.
If you've joined this webcast late, as we're broadcasting live on Thursday, February 18th of 2021, normally we invite the audience to ask questions, but we are pre-recording this actually on the same day, but a different hour. So that's why there are no questions in the attendees column because our guest needed to do it this time. And my guest is Candacy Taylor. She's the author of a book called Overground Railroad, which is a history of a Black travel in the United States, and it's based on a guidebook called the Green Book. Joe, I know the sixth picture I sent you was a picture of 4 covers of the Green Book. Can you put those on the screen at your leisure here while I ask Candacy to tell us about the guy? One guy started this in Harlem, right? Do I recall? Yeah. Okay, there's 4 covers there's 4 editions, and you can see the years 51, 52, 53, 54. So tell us about this one person who started this.
Yeah, Victor Greene was an incredible man. I think he was kind of the Steve Jobs of his time, because he solved a very simple problem. Like, I mean, when you think about, what Steve Jobs did, he put a camera in a phone and then became almost a civil rights tool, right? True. A very simple thing. And in the same way, I think Victor Greene, he created the Green Book in 1936, and he lived in Harlem, and he was a postal worker. And he worked full-time as a postal worker until the age of 52 in the 50s. So he was still very active. He did both things. He ran the Green Book and also was a postal worker.
And he sold the ads. He sold small ads to anybody who would buy them, and solicited people to write in and say, hey, if you know of a hotel or a particularly welcoming place or town or restaurant or whatever, he really, the Tim and Nina Zagat of Black guides in its time, soliciting people, regular citizens, to let him know about places that he could put in the next edition. And you said you don't think he didn't particularly get rich off this, did he?
No, I mean, I think, when I looked at some of his records in the 40s and late 40s, he was still claiming the income of a postal worker. So maybe it paid for itself. The rate of the guide changed from like a quarter to, I think, got up to like $1.75 over the years. His wife, Alma Duke Greene, was also a very critical figure. I think she was also what kept the business afloat because he was still working full time. But it was very...
I'm sorry to interrupt. She took it over after he died, didn't she? Yeah,
she did. She was listed as the main publisher and editor in the 1959 edition. Victor Greene died in 1960, so he didn't even see this passage of the Civil Rights Act. But yeah, it was an incredible guide because I think he had this idea. I mean, even in Harlem in 1935, the year before the first edition came out, there was a major riot in Harlem because there was so much racial segregation within. And this is after the 20s, right? You think of the Harlem Renaissance and you think it was this Black Mecca. And there were a lot of incredible things happening in Black culture in Harlem at that time, but it was still a very heavily segregated community. So half the places on 125th Street, which is a main shopping district, Black people still didn't know where they could go, or they couldn't they could only sit in orchestra seats or sit in the mezzanine in certain theaters. And Victor Greene made the Green Book because he just wanted to, and it was a Harlem guide. It was not a national guide for many years, until many years after that. But he was solving his own immediate problem in Harlem. And he did have a friend who was Jewish, who used a kosher guide to go up north to the Borscht Belt when he traveled for vacations. And so we think also it was his Jewish friend who inspired Victor Greene to say, hey, we could do something like that too for us.
Right. There are a couple of colorful pictures you have, Joe, of buildings that are still alive, I think. I know that Candacy visited these over a course of several years. This is, I presume, is Capitol Hill. Is this in Washington, D.C.?
No, that's Portland, Oregon.
Oh, and as far as you know, is the Capitol Hill Motel still running?
It was when I was there. I think it was 2017.
We'll go with that.
Yeah.
Great sign.
It is. It's a beautiful neon sign.
That's a collectible sign.
Yeah, they kept it. They I don't know if it's been recently restored because usually they don't look that good.
You have another one, Joe? I think we have 2 more, Joe, if you want to go ahead and put them up. Ah, yeah.
Woodbine, yeah, that's in upstate New York. That was still, yeah, I think that was 2018.
Did any of these places ever have signs saying, Negroes allowed, or I mean, did you have
If
to
they
know?
did, if they did, they don't now, but
I hope
there were
not.
some that said colored
Welcome.
welcome, and yeah, they, I think especially in the South, I saw more of those. If you look at the old black and white photographs, you'll see that they modified them over time. Um, you know, like air conditioning and HBO and other things that just kind of evolved around.
All right. You want to put the third one up there, Joe? I think I had three. Oh, no, the third one was the pictures of the guides. I'm sorry. It was a picture of the green guides.
And also, just so you know, for thankfully the Schomburg Center in Harlem, I got a fellowship there as well. They digitized the Green books. So if you Google NYPL Green Book, you can see up to like 24 editions that you can flip through. And they're all digitized. It's a huge gift because when I started this project, there were only 2 that we had access to.
Oh my goodness, that's great! Yeah. You can look at every page of those editions.
Yeah, you can just scroll through.
Oh, yeah. I will put that in the newsletter. That's great. Good. And if you don't subscribe to the newsletter, go to maxatours.com and run all the way down to the bottom of the page, and it's free.
Oh, there it is.
Oh, there it is. Oh, good job, Joe. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That is great. I'm a member of the New York Public Library. I should.
Great. Yeah, no, I love the NYPL. This was a huge gift for us. And yeah, when you click on it, you can
turn the page.
Actually, yeah, you can turn the page. You just keep clicking. Yeah.
Look at that. Well, that's well done. I'm glad that happened. Now, there was a movie called The Green Book, right?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you did, obviously. Did you have some thoughts on it? I can't discuss it with you because I never saw it. I meant to watch it before we talked today, but that time didn't allow me.
Yeah, no, it wasn't really about the Green Book, so you didn't really miss anything. I mean, it was really a buddy film.
The musicians traveling through America, or United States, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember the thumbnail description when it came out. Oh, so the Green Book did not play a big part in there, but was it ever mentioned?
No, the fact that it was called Green Book was pretty scandalous and egregious, I thought. I mean, and a lot of people agreed. I mean, it was literally mentioned 3 times in the entire film. Supposedly, they're using the Green Book to drive down south, and the references that they do make are largely not accurate, unfortunately. For instance, Dr. Shirley is this, incredible, and thankfully, it was great to see his story being told. Of course, the family was upset with how his story was told. So I don't know anything about that because I didn't study it early. But the performances were really powerful, and I think that's why the film was so popular. And people really enjoyed that. But in terms of, it should have just been called something different. It should not have been titled Green Book because it really misrepresented it.
I'm sorry, Pardon? Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Oh, I just think it really misrepresented it because for instance, Dr. Shirley, they go to Birmingham, Alabama, and they've got to find a place to stay because he can't stay in the white hotel. And he supposedly is using the Green Book, and it's 1963 or 62 or 63. And they take him to this downtrodden, and this is a very, very professional, very, upper class musician who has an incredible amount of taste. And I mean, that's kind of the buddy, that's what makes it so funny is this Italian brute is with this, refined black man.
Right.
So they take him to this downtrodden place. He's very uncomfortable. It's the stereotype of what you would think of poor black folks. And if he really had the Green Book at that time, he would have taken him to the A.G. Gaston, which was like the creme de la creme of black hotels of the South, and it's where King stayed and all these fancy people stayed, and he would have been very comfortable, there. So it's unfortunate that the filmmakers didn't just do their homework or just didn't call us. I mean, me and Calvin Ramsey at the time were the two leading Black historians on the Green Book, and we both were calling each other saying, have you heard? Because we knew this film was being produced and shot in New Orleans, and it's like and then they did reach out to me after the film had been made. And so I'm supposedly on the DVD because they had to interview me. Universal Studios came to me and said the first question everybody had after the screenings was, what is a Green Book? So they needed me to come and explain it.
So did you never even saw a cover of the Green Book on your lap in the movie ever? I mean, did you ever see?
They reference it right in the beginning where they see, they're getting in the car and it's like, oh, we're going to use this, guy.
Oh, they have right.
Yeah,
but they never.
But it was just a second. It was never,
Well, that's weird. To title a movie and have people end the movie and go, what was the thing about the Green Book?
Yeah.
Gosh. Yeah. Well, you certainly laid that to rest with your book. It's just a delight to read, and the history. I mean, I didn't grow up a lot. I mean, those in the early days when part of this book, my dad was in the Army, so I was in Europe, and I didn't know this stuff, and it doesn't make me necessarily proud to be white American. I don't want to get into guilt or anything, but I was like, wait a minute.
A lot of Black people didn't know either. And I mean,
really?
I studied Black history in college, and I still learned an incredible amount when I was writing this book. And that is the boat that we're all in as Americans. A lot of us, most of the Black people I was talking to in 2013 had never heard of the Green Book. A lot of Black people on book tour came to me of all ages and all generations saying, I didn't know. So you're not alone.
The book, though, makes perfect sense. I mean, the Green Book, because we all generally know, how tumultuous those years were for civil rights. And it just makes perfect sense that someone would go, it's dangerous. You're a Black family who wants to go on vacation. You're considering danger as much as you are, what sights you're going to see when you get to the place you're going to. And it just makes perfect sense that someone would come up with a book and identify those places where you are welcome and where you can feel safe. And particularly the sundown, I keep saying sundown city towns, right? Sundown towns. That's sundown. That's like, come on. Although, I moved here from DC and New York, 20 years ago for a woman here. I live in St. Paul, Minnesota, Candacy. And I have a good friend, a lawyer who lives in a suburb here called St. Louis Park. And I was stunned. Minnesota Public Radio did a story shortly after I moved here on all the codicils. And you could not, a Jew could not buy a house in that neighborhood for decades until like the 70s or something. I'm like, what? I'm in Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey, a lot of liberals here. And we're up north. This is not the deep, dark South, as they say. So those sort of flashes of history that come along, particularly to an old guy like I am. It's not like I haven't lived and seen some things, or covered some things as a journalist. And you just find out, wait a minute, this nice neighborhood where I come to have dinner with my lawyer, you couldn't come here if you were Jewish? You couldn't buy a house here? They would just say, no, you can't buy a house there. And to know that I, as an Army brat, my father we'd go on vacation, and we certainly wouldn't give a thought about where we're going to get our gas, where we're going to overnight, whether we'd be accepted, at the Howard Johnsons. And it's just, sometimes you learn these things later in life, as I have with your book, and you're just shocked. And that's why I wanted to have you join me today. And I'm so glad you did. I'm just so thrilled to have discovered your book and that we could talk a little longer than 6 minutes. So thank you, Candace.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it was an incredible, it's been an incredible process doing this work. And I continue even beyond the book, the exhibition that's touring, and I'm developing a board game. I also have a mobile app that I'm working on that I hope to have out next year, maybe later this year, depending. And I just finished a young reader's version of this book that will be published in 2021 in January.
And do you have a website? You do, I know. Mm-hmm. And which is?
It's
I didn't write.
tailormadeculture.com.
That's right.
So,
tailormadeculture.com.
mm-hmm.
You can find out more about this book, as well as that's where I found out Candace had done a book on Route 66. I would someday like to drive that whole route. I've certainly looked at the history of it in some of the towns and found it fascinating. So check it out, tailormadeculture.com,
Mm-hmm.
Taylor. Candace, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm delighted to have you, and good luck on all those many projects that grew out of this book and your study of it.
I really appreciate your interest in the interview. Thank you so much.
Thanks, and I appreciate you all watching. As always, we'll do it again in 2 weeks. Meanwhile, travel safely if you do travel, and have a good couple of weeks. See you again live next week. Bye-bye.